And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Hi, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. Starting off for our marine forecast, we'll first take a look at some of our surface maps to see what's driving some of our marine forecast. Out over the Bering Sea, we have a weak low moving through from west to east that is bringing some westerly winds to the Aleutian Islands, some lighter flow pattern out over much of the southwestern coastline, as well as rain to those same areas, rain extending out over much of the mainland as well. Up to the north, we have an area of low pressure. On the north side of that, we're going to start to see some easterly winds for our marine zones, as well as rain throughout the northern portions of the state. As you look out over southeast Alaska, fairly dry in terms of precipitation and fairly light for flow. We're not seeing a lot of wind there in this pattern at this time on Friday. As we move into Saturday, still pretty light in terms of winds for southeast Alaska, but we are going to see the return of rain to the area, and we're going to have to keep an eye on the Suicide Basin near the Juneau area, where we could see some flooding from a glacial dam release for the Mendenhall River, as we already seen water levels in Suicide Basin higher than they were when they released last year. So the next week or so, we do anticipate that glacial dam release. Out over the mainland part of the state, we have a low that has moved into the southwestern portion of the state, allowing for some southwesterly flow for the western portions of the Gulf as well as around Kodiak Island. And that's also going to spread rain throughout much of mainland Alaska to include areas around Cook Inlet. We will see some heavier precipitation on the western side of Kenai Peninsula as well as the western areas of the Susitna Valley. Rain is going to spread throughout the mainland, getting up into the Brooks Range, and we are going to see lighter flow in terms of our marine forecast up there as we have high pressure building in, not a lot of forcing until we get back down along the west coast. We'll see some northerly flow around our low pressure system along the coastline. Out over the rest of the Bering, not too heavy in terms of anticipated winds in this area. We do have some weak ridging following behind our frontal system, and we will have some rain moving into the Bering Sea as well as the Aleutian Islands. For the rest of our marine forecast, we'll first take a quick look at our ice edge. With some of the warmer flow we have coming from the rivers out in the northeastern part of the state, we do anticipate continued melting over especially the northeastern portions where our ice is. And then we are still going to see, with those easterly winds we were talking about, we are going to start to see the ice push off to the west from that. Now down in the southeastern portions of the state in the inside waters, fairly light winds, 10 knots out of a south to southeast direction. Out over the Gulf waters, fairly light as well, 10 to 15 knots here in the eastern locations out of the south. And as we get farther to the north, we're going to see northwesterly winds. On Saturday, still light in the inside waters, slightly southerly up to as high as 10 knots, and then very weak winds out over the Gulf waters, 5 to 10 knots expected. As we look out over the south central area, staying in the Gulf here, light winds around 10 knots through much of the Gulf and into Prince William Sound. A little bit higher as we get by the Barren Islands, south to southeast winds 15 to 20 knots there, and then southerly winds 20 knots in Cook Inlet. On Saturday, we're still seeing fairly light winds out over much of the Gulf, only around 10 knots in Prince William Sound as well. Out by the Barren Islands, east to southeast winds around 20 knots there, and then still southerly winds in Cook Inlet, around 15 knots expected. On Friday for the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, around Kodiak Island, southerly component to the winds around 15 knots. Weak winds on the Bering side of the peninsula, 10 to 15 knots out of a somewhat southwesterly direction. And then northerly winds on the Pacific side, 10 to 20 knots, strongest as we get closer towards False Pass, weaker as we get closer towards Kodiak Island. On Saturday around Kodiak Island, south winds 15 to 20 knots. And then on the Pacific side of the peninsula, only around 10 knots for most locations, picking up a little bit by False Pass, out of northwesterly direction around 15 knots. Westerly winds on the Bering side around 15 knots. Out over the Aleutian Islands on Friday, out by the eastern Aleutians, westerly winds 15 to 20 knots. Southwest winds 20 knots over the central Aleutian Islands. As we get by the western Aleutian Islands, southerly winds 15 to 25 knots, highest east of Kiska. And on Saturday, west to southwest winds 15 to 20 knots for the western Aleutian Islands. Central Aleutian Islands, west winds 20 knots. And then that's going to be true for the eastern Aleutian Islands, 20 knots out of that westerly direction. Along the west coast of the state, up north, we're going to see southwest winds 15 to 20 knots. South of Nunavik Island, we're going to see westerly winds 10 to 15 knots. Then out by St. Matthew Island, southwest 15, and southerly winds 15 knots by the Pribilof Islands. On Saturday, really light winds out over much of the Bering Sea for St. Matthew and the Pribilof Islands, only variable 10 knots expected. Westerly winds 10 to 15 knots north of Nunavik Island, and still somewhat of a westerly component south of the island, still only around 10 to 15 knots. Down the west coast of the state, we're really going to start to pay attention to one of the lows that we have there. We'll see very difference of flow pattern on the south side and north side of where that low is. On the south side, we'll see southwest winds around 20 knots. North of that, we'll see northeast winds picking up to 20 to 25 knots as we get farther to the north. And then east to northeast winds along the Arctic coastline, 15 to 20 knots expected. On Saturday, flow switching up, it's going to come westerly for the more eastern locations of the Arctic coast, 15 to 20 knots there. Down the west coast of the state, 20 to 25 knots on the northwest coast, 15 to 20 knots as we get closer towards the Bering Strait.